in February 2017. The poll, which was conducted under a subcontract with Luntz Global Partners, showed that Americans trust their governors and were more optimistic about their state's future than they were about their country's future. And from what I'm hearing in the conversations today and yesterday, I think this comes as no surprise to all of you. Voters said that they agree that their governors work hard and serve their constituents, and they also agree that their governors and state governments and associated county and regional governments work hard together to deliver results. Among the findings from this national survey after the election that are perhaps most salient to the conversations we're having today include results from when we asked a nationally representative sample of folks this question, quote, how much confidence do you have in your local government, your state government, and your federal government? While only 40% of respondents confirmed that they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in the federal government, a notably higher percentage of folks stated that they are confident in their state and local governments, 62 and 72% respectively, still after the election. In an era where some voters may not feel listened to all the time and where they want their leaders to truly be their voice, governors, state agencies, and affiliated regional and county governments are poised to deliver their results that their constituents want. Now, to be clear, this is not about being partisan or picking sides. After all, NGA is a nonpartisan organization, and we serve the full spectrum of the governor's political viewpoints. What this really says to us is how the American people are calling for a new relationship with and a new relationship between their governments. For example, when folks are asked to think about what they wanted most out of their state elected officials after the 2016 election, 67% of people responded by saying that the most important thing was for their state elected officials to cooperate and compromise to get things done, working with politicians from other parties, even if it means you don't get everything you want. So when it comes to which issues we're talking about here, which issues folks actually want their state governments to invest in, among the top 5 issues include reasons which I'm sure drove many of you to attend this conference today. A, providing a quality education to every child in every community. I think Akron really drove that home this morning. And B, providing more assistance to the working poor so that they can have a ladder to become more self-sufficient. What we know is that federal law, regulations, and policy guidance, as well as current flexibilities, provide state, county, and local leaders with an opportunity to think strategically about how to meet economic, educational, housing, and health needs of low-income parents and their children together. Right now is your opportunity as leaders in your areas to demonstrate your leadership in partnering with federal, county, local, and private sector partners in identifying innovations in public service that actually work for the low-income people living in your communities. These incredible opportunities include an opportunity for you to demonstrate your strong state, local leadership, and to create cross-county and cross-jurisdictional partnerships to provide unified fronts on certain issues. I think a really great example of strong state leadership across agencies is Governor Mark Dayton's Homework Starts with Home initiative, which is an $8 million investment to connect families in Minnesota with stable housing. With the awareness that housing instability is a major contributor to chronic absenteeism, this initiative brings together local school leaders, nonprofit organizations, and other community partners to create housing stability for students and their families who are experiencing homelessness. That said, though, I'm sure nobody in Governor Dayton's office would say that that was easy or that it's going to be a quick and simple fix. After all, asking folks to collaborate across agencies is really hard work, and it's rife with its own unique financial considerations as well as its own world of political considerations. In my role at NGA, I'm currently leading a multi-state long-term technical assistance effort with a set of 5 states who are working within their state governments across agencies to develop and implement unique 2-generation state strategies to achieve systems change to better serve low-income families as a whole. The thing that I think is so exciting about this 2-generation project is that for many of the states involved, we're bringing together agencies who don't typically work together, but who do typically serve exactly the same families at different agencies across the board every single day. And we're asking them to get together to collaborate and identify innovative approaches to serving children and families together. And I'm very fortunate to be joined here on the stage today by Jovon, who is helping to lead the 2Gen statewide interagency effort in the state of Minnesota from her seat at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. Also joining us today are Greg Russ from the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. Greg Russ from the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, and Stephen Norman of the King County Housing Authority in Washington State. And while your agenda might note that there's a fourth panelist, unfortunately she wasn't able to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances. But since carrying on in the face of unforeseen circumstances is what we all do every single day, we are going to carry on unfazed. So for Jovon and Greg and Stephen, I've asked each of them to share about 7 or so minutes of remarks highlighting who they are, what they do, and 1 or 2 innovative projects or partnerships that they're affiliated with. And what I want each of you guys to do is twofold. Part 1 is to grab a pen and a spare sheet of paper. If you don't have paper, there's a lot of paper in your white folders. You can write on the back of something. And write down the top 1 or 2 things from this panel discussion related to innovative partnership making or community building that you'd like to take back home and share with folks in your organization, or that you'd like to dig deeper into in these next set of breakout sessions. And since we're asking folks to hold their questions until the end, the second thing I'm asking you to do is to jot down your burning questions that occur to you while we're speaking, so that you have a chance to remember to ask them during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jovon first. Let's start with you, and let's hear a little bit about who you are, what you do, what your organization does, and your work in developing a 2-generation state strategy and how you're working to help low-income children and families.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So in my day job, I work as the Economic Assistance and Employment Supports Division Director. And what that basically means is that within my division are the cash and food programs for Minnesota, which includes TANF and SNAP, as well as the Refugee and Resettlement Office for Minnesota, and our CAP agencies, community action agencies in Minnesota as well. And that division is within the Department of Human Services, and we focus primarily on addressing concerns of poverty for children and families. And so I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that we're doing in Minnesota, one of which in our division is a big one, is our 2Gen, Minnesota 2Gen network. And that work really came out of frustration, honestly, with our work with across agencies, with families. We realized that we're all serving similar populations. But when the governor asked us, state agencies, to come into a space to figure out how we can better serve families and how we can have better outcomes for education, we all really narrowed down to the core things that all families need, regardless if they're poor or not, need in order to thrive, and those are those 2Gen components. They all need housing, they all need education, they all need employment and economic security, they all need health and well-being and social capital and early childhood education. But as soon as we all agreed, we also started posturing. Posturing to say, yes, we all need those things, but you must fund me first as a state agency to do this work. And we don't want to give up any resource or share any resource. So how do we, and our structure is really set up in a competitive way. So how do we come together and unite in a way that is productive to really create some systems change and impact? So our governor developed a children's cabinet, and that children's cabinet was really focused on the outcomes for children and families. And it was made up of the commissioners of all of these different state agencies and their lead staff, myself being one of them. And in that children's cabinet, we decided that we're going to start creating some initiatives that really work differently with our communities. And we're going to take the competition out of the equation. we're going to look at what funding streams are available that are nimble, and we're going to start there first, so that there's no reason for us to beg for more money out of the legislature. There's no reason for anyone to give up anything. We're going to have this pocket of money or this bucket of money that is really, truly going to be for innovation. So that was our start. And from there, we began to look at, okay, so how do we want to engage communities? Because we realize that policy is often made in that environment, in that bubble, in that room, and without a real genuine connection to community or to the families that are experiencing the policy. How do we break that? How do we reinvent how we create policy and how we engage this work? So we decided to partner with local partners. In Minnesota, we call them Promise Neighborhoods, and they are funded out of the Race to the Top funding. They're located, there's 4 sites altogether, and they're located across Minneapolis, or Minnesota, in metro areas, rural areas, a tribal reservation as well, and a county that services many immigrants and refugees. And our purpose for engaging them was, one, that they were already doing really innovative work with families directly. They were participating in schools. They were really focusing their work around the family as a whole unit or a whole model, and not dissecting the family up. But they didn't have very good connections with counties. In Minnesota, we are a state supervised but county administered state. So without that connection with counties, there was still a great divide between the services that families were experiencing and their access to those services, and the stop and go, and the many different case managers that were in their lives. So we wanted to bridge that divide as well. So we said, okay, so when we think about the ecosystem of what a family has to navigate, there's these local partners, there's counties, and then there's the state agencies that are kind of holding the purse strings and deciding policy and things like that. How about we all come together? And we put families at the center of that conversation, and we start working towards co-creating what policy looks like, what programming looks like, and we create an environment that is open enough to hold tension so that we can disagree, we can fail, and we can pick up and learn from it and move on, and better ourselves and better the system that families are experiencing. So that's what we did. That's where we start. That's where we began. And within also choosing those specific sites, they were also chosen too because in Minnesota, we usually do very, very well in performance measures, national performance measures for public assistance programs and things like that. But when you pull back the layers of those performance measures, what you find is that Minnesota has very, very deep disparities across racial lines. Some of the deepest and most egregious really in the country for African Americans and for Native Americans. And they're around, those disparities are around economics, around education, and around employment. And so we really wanted to also partner with local areas that were serving those populations specifically and learn from innovative ways of how they're effectively serving those populations, understand more deeply what culturally responsive services are, what culturally responsive activities are, how they are engaging in building social capital, how they're really engaging the identity of a person, and how that is the carrot, if you will, for driving an adult in the family to move beyond being dependent upon public aid. So it's been just a tremendous learning experience. I think I'll stop there for now and let the other panelists introduce themselves. Thank you.
So I'm only on the panel to meet Jovon, since I'm only 5 months in Minneapolis, and prior to that, 12 years in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as executive director. And I thought it would be useful to give you just a couple of quick things about, boy, what a difference geography makes, and how changing communities also kind of changes your mind about what kind of reach you should try to achieve, especially with state and regional approaches. And I don't mean to suggest that Cambridge should somehow create some kind of regional entity, but the dynamics are very different. For example, that was a much smaller geographic community. It was 6.5 square miles and would fit in one ward of Minneapolis, probably. And that community was very densely structured, both the housing and the population. But to Jovon's point, it was much more homogeneous in certain ways. We would have public housing property in neighborhoods, and half a block away, they were selling one floor of what they would call a 3-flat for $800,000 as a condo. So the mix and the churn were much more evident, and that led to connections in Cambridge that were very fascinating, and I think also shining a light on how you might step out of your community into the regional or state level. We had, at the time in Cambridge, 46% of the kids in the high school were public housing or voucher families. So the high school had a huge incentive to talk with us since we shared that same population. And we took advantage of that. And that was because we had in place, before I got there, probably one of the most robust after-school programs that I'd ever had the opportunity to see. It had the interesting name of the workforce program, but it was really an 8th grade through 12th grade program that essentially touched those kids in the widest way possible in everything from do you need help with homework, do you need help with standardized testing, and do you want to know how to dress to go to a job interview? So it was like the whole ball of yarn. You had it right there. And one of the big things about that program was we opened a site inside the high school. We had 3 sites at the properties. We opened a site inside the high school because we could not capture the voucher families readily. And I think in that model, there is some way to think about possibly collaborating at larger levels, but it made that collaboration with the school system very unique. We had the 1 high school and maybe about 12 to 15 elementary and middle schools. But that's in the past. And here's Minneapolis. And it's a giant Midwestern city, if I could use that terminology. There's over, just in the city itself, the school system itself has over 56 locations. And in fact, it was interesting, I met for the first time, and I hope for many more meetings with the school superintendent and his staff on Monday. But I think what I'd like to echo, just observing where I am now, Jovon hit it right on the head. Minneapolis is a divided city. The mapping, if you look at the racial and poverty impaction, is significantly different than Cambridge, which was much more homogeneous. The north side of the city is underinvested, and it stands in stark contrast to the southern part of the city. And in that mix, we have a variety of education issues. And our kids that are receiving vouchers or living in public housing aren't in the same proportion that they are that we had in Cambridge, but they're there. The other thing you have to remember about Minneapolis is that almost all, the bulk of our assistance to families is through the voucher program, and we have a small pool of family housing, scattered site, and one traditional public housing complex, but that's only about 1,100 units. So it's a very different mix than I had in Cambridge, and argues for a different approach. I would say that one of the things that we want to do in this new position is begin to, so I went to see the superintendent, and he has this map of the city, and it's like 3 stories high. And I started, it's gigantic, it's, but every school is there. And I thought to myself, you know, I think that school is really close to one of our senior buildings. And you don't think about your senior pop buildings maybe this way, but it started me thinking, well, we have a lot of underutilized common area space, some apartments that have been taken offline, all kinds of things. So one of the first things we want to talk about is, what is our geography? What's the common geography that we share in the community with the school system? And then I think that could lead to other types of connections and repurposing, perhaps, the space that we have to somehow complement something that the school is trying to do. And I don't know what that would be exactly, but I think it's an interesting path or thread to pull on. And I love the thread. It's so true. It was very good. And the last thing I wanted to say is that there's a number of collaboration potentials, and we'll talk a little bit maybe around not only inside the city boundaries, but I believe, again, to our point, is lifting a program. What if someone moves out of Minneapolis to St. Paul and the program disappears, or to Richmond or Bloomington, or and how do we sustain that? And we'll talk a little bit about that in the question period, but very glad to be here, and I'll turn it over to my gentleman on my left, who's highly regarded, I understand. So please, Stephen.
Well, I think I'm sort of a little bit of Malcolm in the middle here, in that what I'm going to talk about is an area that is smaller than the state but larger than Cambridge. And it's actually more akin, I think, to what you heard on the prior panel about Summit County. So let me give you a quick frame. The King County Housing Authority serves the county of Martin Luther King outside of the city of Seattle. There are about 2.1 million folks living in the county. 1.4 million live outside the city, the bulk of them within growth management boundaries. The county's actually larger than the state of Delaware. And significantly, poverty has moved out of the center city, which is what I think you're seeing in much of the rest of the country. And the majority of poor families and poor children now live in the suburbs. We house about 20,000 children every night. About a little over 14,000 of those are in our federally assisted programs. The bulk of these children are very poor. 40% are in refugee immigrant families. English is not necessarily spoken at home, and there's a high preponderance of what we call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. It's arguably some of the most at-risk children in the community. We deal with 19 school districts, and I think the diversity in terms of both racial diversity and income diversity that you've heard about is very much present here. We have school districts that have a 75% free and reduced meal rate. We have school districts that have a 4% free and reduced meal rate. We have schools that are commonly within the top 10 school districts ranked in the country, and others who have scores that are clearly struggling by anybody's metric. So let me talk for a moment about who our partners are on a regional basis, who we touch on a state basis, and then about sort of the toolkit of different things that we are doing, and then I think we can drill down on those further in the Q&A if folks are interested. I think three key regional partnerships. One is with the Puget Sound Educational Services District. This is most of you may have educational service districts structures in your state. These are sort of back office school districts. They're run by a superintendent who provide an array of training and logistic and purchasing and planning functions to the 19 school districts in the county. They also oversee the Head Start early learning programs as essentially the funnel for the Head Start money into the region. They are a critical partner of ours, and one way in which we have signaled the focus that we have on education is that I have 5 commissioners, and one of them deliberately is the superintendent of the ESD. So there is that very close relationship on a policy and a governance level to emphasize that public housing, public education are two sides of the same coin. Our missing partner today was actually one of the senior management team at the ESD. Fortunately, she fell sick at the last moment, so in a way, I'm going to be channeling her as well today. Second is what we call the Roadmap Project, which is a backbone nonprofit organization, very akin to, I think, what I've heard about in Summit this morning. And they work with the 7 school districts that span from South Seattle through South County, where the bulk of the poverty is, in terms of organizing very much along the lines that you heard. Was successful in going out, getting a $40 million Race to the Top grant into the consortium. I think it was the first time a consortium of the school districts had gotten an RT3. And one of the things that's being used for is funding what we call deep dives into elementary schools that are feeder schools to large concentrations of federally subsidized communities. And a third is the community of practice. I think you'll hear more about that later. It's generously funded by the Gates Foundation, but the Tacoma, the Seattle, and the King County Housing Authorities meet regularly with our school district partners. It's great. I've discovered if the Gates Foundation lays out a free lunch, and they do a really good job on lunch, folks, people come. And we have a very strong, vibrant, robust conversation going each of the 3 districts. And I think one of the things that should be a theme of these discussions is that things will be different. The context, the strategies, the players, the resources in every community. But there are commonalities underneath those, and these continuums of practice, communities of practice are very useful in sort of working those things through and doing the kind of cross-fertilization that we're doing on a national level today. On the state level, we work with the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. We work with the Child Welfare, particularly around our FUP and the issue of homeless youth. And we work with what is called the Department of Early Learning. And I'll drill down a little bit more on the state pieces later if we're interested. And finally, I think the other important partner to remember at the table is the community college system. So a quick set of 5 sort of major arenas that we're engaged in. The first, given the diversity across the county in terms of opportunity, we've mapped out using the Kirwan Institute metrics the communities of opportunity, and we are engaged in providing geographic choice to families. In many ways, geographic choice is education choice, and we have a whole array of site-based and mobility strategies. Currently, 24% of our families with children who are subsidized under the federal programs live in neighborhoods of opportunity. And this is close to twice the national level. We have a large array of programs that we're using to provide that amount of choice. One example is we now have public housing on Mercer Island, which is a school district with the 4% free and reduced meal level. So we're really able to provide some access for those kids into those neighborhoods. Doesn't mean our job is done. There's an issue of connectivity into the school, helping parents navigate, connecting them into support programs in those neighborhoods. But it is a significant thing to be able to provide that access. Second is around homelessness and classroom stability. And we hear time and time again when I talk to superintendents, I talk to school principals, that the amount of turnover in the classroom, both kids who are homeless and kids who are unstably housed, is an enormous drag on both the outcomes for those individual kids and for the classroom as a whole. For an array of reasons. As Michael Mira is fond of saying, it's like trying to teach in a Greyhound bus station. And it is really disruptive. We have a series of different programs that are trying to address this. In King County, which has a median income of $75,000 per household, last year the school districts reported 8,000 homeless school children. So this is getting worse, and we're seeing double-digit increases each year. We have a short-term rental assistance program. I've learned not to call it rapid rehousing because there isn't necessarily anything rapid about it, and it also doesn't fit the national model in terms of what rapid rehousing should look like. But we do this in partnership with one school district. We jointly selected a nonprofit to work with us, the McKinney Venner Liaisons in the schools, refer out or screen in children who are homeless, and we provide them with 6 months of rental assistance, client assistance, employment navigation, an array of other things. We've successfully rehoused some 400 children through this program. We are looking at scaling it up, and I'd be happy to talk at greater length about sort of the pluses and minuses of this program. I will be the first to tell you that short-term rental assistance and rapid rehousing are not a silver bullet, but they can be effective tools in certain situations. A third is early learning programs. The jury is in. The data tells us that probably where we can make our biggest impact is in the 0 to 3 range. We have a program where we've partnered with a school district where school district employees work with families which we have public health clinics involved with our properties. As the parents come through the pre- and postnatal care programs, they're referred into the school district. It's based on the Harlem Children's Zone Baby Academy, where you're working with both the children and the parents around a whole array of things to encourage cognitive development in 0 to 3. It also gives us an opportunity to start connecting the parents at an early point into the education system, lining them up for quality child care and early learning programs, again with the notion that we're trying to get folks to kindergarten ready to learn, particularly critical in our non-English speaking families. Another is our development of after-school programs that do both school year programs and also learning retention programs during the summer. One of the challenges in poverty moving out of the center city to the suburbs is transportation and access to programs. You may have great programs on the school sites, but the problem is that those are for kids who keep getting picked up after the program ends, with poor populations, with working parents. The reality is they either get on those yellow buses at the end of the school day or they don't get home. So we've started building a series of facilities. We've actually built 14 after-school facilities and 4 early learning facilities on the sites of our housing, and we discovered that the market penetration is much greater when you can actually put the services on folks' doorstep, particularly with immigrant refugee populations. The fact that the kids are right there and they can see them and they know where they are seems to play a role in engaging both the kids and then the parents in these programs. And then the challenge is essentially pivoting generations of after-school programs whose primary focus was on keeping kids off the street, out of gangs, off drugs, to really a fourth leg, which is to start to tie that into the educational goals and to provide the support, particularly in cases where the support can't be provided at home, to help them achieve and succeed in school. And finally, a fifth tool is around placemaking. No matter how successful our mobility programs are in broadening geographic access, at the end of the day, the majority of poor children are still going to be living in poor neighborhoods for an array of reasons. And we are using redevelopment, Hope 6 choice neighborhoods in White Center, the poorest community in the region. We've redeveloped a complex to include an elementary school, a Head Start facility, an Educare Center, which is a Warren Buffett-funded approach that is basically Head Start on steroids, public health clinic, Boys and Girls Club, community college classrooms, public library, police substation, all of this within a 2-block core, and sized not just to the public housing community that is on the site, but sized to the neighborhood, because the neighborhood is underserved, and we also don't believe in segregating out programs by the project kids versus the rest of the neighborhood. And now we've moved from the build-out stage to the questions of coordinating programs, sharing data, and designing joint initiatives. All of this is done under a platform of data sharing, which I can't begin to tell you how tough that is. We have data sharing agreements with 3 school districts, and we are constantly refining and strengthening how we can evaluate actual program performance, actual outcomes, and moving the needle for kids. The big picture goals are really stabilizing the classrooms, early learning and kindergarten readiness, connecting parents to schools, reducing absenteeism, reading at grade level in 3rd grade, and at 4th grade being proficient at that level in math. So that's sort of an overview of what we're doing and who we're doing it with. Happy to drill down as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Wow, this is great. So I think, a major takeaway for me here is that, of course, we weren't able to identify the one single golden answer to all of our questions and problems, but there is a lot of good, strong, promising practices here and a lot of really good, scalable, anecdotal examples that we're all hearing and learning today. And I'm realizing that, perhaps something that is possibly an elephant in the room is this: regardless of whether you work in the spectrum of delivering services to low-income children and families, inevitably there's this question that will come from the family that's essentially related to benefit cliffs, and whether it actually makes sense for the household breadwinner of the family to accept that promotion or that new job, after they've been so successful in your job training program or your wraparound services, because maybe they're worried about losing their housing subsidy or their TANF check or their subsidized childcare or their health, et cetera. And so the question for you guys is, reflecting on that, are there any promising practices or observations or experiences from your work that can help address this question? I'm aware that Minnesota is working on some innovative technology interventions to this effect. So not to put you on the spot, Jovon, but maybe we can start with you and then we'll move on to others.
Yeah, this reminds me of a conversation I had not too long ago with a really large employer in Minnesota. The employer is this fantastic headquarters in North Minneapolis, or I should say in the suburbs of North Minneapolis. And they had this idea that, okay, we want to create 200 jobs this year by this August, and we want North Minneapolis residents to be in those jobs, and we want Cedar Riverside area residents to be in these jobs. And we're going to call all of the state officials of, particular programs that provide support to these individuals to a meeting, and we're going to figure out and solve childcare issues, cliff issues, everything in one meeting, because that's how the for-profit world is used to working. We're going to do it. We're going to figure it out. And so we all got in this meeting, and it was very apparent that they were not aware that their salary structure was built in a way that was really feeding into the fact that they were losing so many people, that they were creating, or they were assisting in creating the turnover. Of course, our programs and the way that they're structured is really ultimately to blame for that. But so they were starting folks off at about $15 an hour, which is a great kind of livable wage in Minnesota. With that wage, most families, depending on their kind of structure, are able to still have childcare. They're still able to have SNAP. They're still, they may be able to have some cash assistance depending on how large their family is, but they're able to see kind of their head above water at that point. And then within 2 months, the salary structure changed so that they get a $1 raise to $16 an hour. And when that happens, they lose cash, they lose childcare, they lose so many benefits, and in order to break even, they have to make about $32 an hour. That was the turnover. That was why they had so many people coming in and out, in and out. Not that they didn't want the jobs, it's just that I have to make a choice. This is $1 more and I lose all of this, and what do I need to do in order to get to that $32 an hour? So in that conversation, though, I thought, so they weren't seeing that. They didn't know that. And in Minnesota, the Children's Defense Fund, our chapter of the Children's Defense Fund, had created a tool that we're calling and going to rename the Financial Economic Cliff Forecaster. And that tool was really about working with policymakers. It was for us to come to them to say, okay, if we make this change in policy, how will it impact statewide? And I thought, wow, if we could take that tool and drill it down to a level of how, so that families could use it and create scenarios to really start to prepare for what the future holds. They could use these programs and the benefits that are coming from these programs to really create a continuum of care model for themselves, and with our help as programs, state programs, to do that. So this tool that we're developing now is specifically to do that. It's to, a family can go in, they can plug in, or a coach or case manager that's working with the family can plug in all their current economic information, the amount of children they have. They can plug in all the different benefits that they're currently receiving, and they can see how things shift and change and move if they get married and their spouse is making a little bit more money, but they're still eligible for some programs, or they lose hours, or they get a raise, or something happens to their child or something. They can create scenarios to see. They can also see the break-even points of where they are and where they, how much money they need to make to sustain themselves. That information is also linked to our Department of Economic and Employment Development agency, state agency. And at that state agency, there is a lot of labor market information and employer information. So it talks about career pathways and the different livable wages that are connected to certain regions within our state. So not only is a family able to see where they are, where the cliff is, and where their break-even point is, but they can also start linking that towards making a plan for their future and what do I have an interest in? How much money can I expect to make in this career pathway? And what do I need to do in order to get there? So it's still in the making and lots to do, but that's one way that we're hoping to address, working collaboratively with families, and employers, I think, as well, from that kind of learned situation experience that I had, of how we can work more effectively with families.
I thought Stephen touched on a couple of points that I think are worth considering. Looking at what I'll be doing in Minneapolis, there's a lot of connection points that we want to pursue. But I keep being struck by the notion, especially there, that we have this regional market. You mentioned the employer north of the city and so forth. And there are a couple of ideas around this that I think we could hope to tease out. And the first is that, at least in terms of how we operate, we're not used to operating in the fullness of our markets. And I mean that there are regional markets beyond whether it's just a city or county, and it's very difficult to connect with other housing authorities. If a family moves to take a job outside of Minneapolis, there's lots of issues around, let's say they have a voucher. There's lots of issues around how that voucher looks when it lands in the receiving community. So we've been advocating conceptually for some kind of regional approach and what I'll call, for lack of a better term, subsidy shaping, so that the subsidy looks the same no matter where it is. And if you're a housing provider, you're kind of stabilizing that platform. I think it could be done with other programs, but I don't know that for sure. And how would you do that? Well, all of us here were created by state enabling legislation. How many state enabling legislations have anything in them about collaboration or consortia? How many state enabling legislations have anything in them about encouraging housing authorities to line up across community boundaries? And how many state enabling legislations would actually sort of have a paragraph on there that would frame some of the things we heard from the panel this morning? I think there's a way that the state governments could be very active in connecting us by encouraging that in an actual piece of legislation. And to be candid, it don't cost nothing. You know, you have to get it in the law and drop it in there, and then maybe the localities and will generate it. So I think the sense that we could collaborate across our municipal boundaries is something that we're going to have to do both for housing and other subsidies. And the cliff effect part of this, there was an idea that we had in the basket in Cambridge but never quite pulled out of it, kind of like a rabbit out of the hat. Because sometimes it's, if you watched Bullwinkle and Rocky, the rabbit was not a rabbit all the time. But yeah. So we thought, what happens when a family begins to earn enough income that the subsidy begins to diminish? And the idea that my deputy came up with at the time, Mike Johnson, was this concept of subsidy graduation insurance. So imagine that you actually get off of your housing subsidy. Many families hesitate at that point. And if we had, whether it's an actual insurance policy or something else, I don't know. But the notion would be that post-subsidy, you have something there that gives you a little bit of a net after you graduate that first 2 or 3 years. And I think that would be an interesting thing to explore both inside our city, but also to a larger scale.
Actually, interestingly enough, we do have a right of return policy on the first couple of years. But I think just to pivot back to the question, it I think strikes to the heart of a fundamental tension within the public housing program. On the one hand, in King County, we have over 10,000 households on our waiting list, many of them homeless. We have a Secretary of HUD who has recently said he doesn't want people to get too comfortable in public housing. On the other side, if we are looking at the long ball outcomes for the households we serve, if the real intent here is to break or prevent multi-generational cycles of poverty and to set up the next generation to not have to come in to public housing, then the issues of stability, of social capital within the community, of permanence within a residence, arguably outweighs the need to use public housing as a transitional stepping stone for folks. And we have gone back and forth. When we create communities such as we have in our Hope Site 6 sites, with the facilities and the resources and the programs, you'd have to be nuts to want to move out of there. And we understand that, and we think actually this over the long term is the right thing to do. that we need more of these communities, but simply saying, well, there's a supply-demand imbalance, so we're going to cycle people through, leaving them to uncertain futures once they have cycled through, doesn't actually move the needle on the longer-term mission that we're engaged in. But this is a very difficult conversation in a time of decreasing domestic investment on the federal level about how we balance a level of need for those in extremis with the fact that truly giving children stable housing connected into a single community with social capital, with programs that the families become familiar with for those children's entire developmental arc. And how do we balance those two? And I don't think we really at this point have an answer.
I really want this panel to last for like 3 more hours.
I'll need more coffee.
But I'm mindful of the time, and I want to give folks a chance to ask questions. So how about now is the time for you to glance at the notes you've been taking and the questions you've been jotting down for yourselves. And when you're asking a question, please say who you are and the organization you're coming from so that we've got context here.
Hi, I'm Kathleen from Seattle Public Schools. Being here illustrates that we, many of us, are trying to tackle the same systemic issues across the country. One of them is the high cost of childcare that makes it difficult for our families in Seattle. We see older high school students taking off 5th and 6th period to go pick up their younger children, and I think I've heard that same story across the country. So I kind of have 2 questions related to that. One, in your cross-sector collaborations, when you see systemic issues like that, how do you decide which agency plays the lead role in kind of exploring or trying to do something about that issue? You know, who has the staffing capacity and resources to address that systemic issue? And then 2, with that issue of high cost of childcare, has that been a topic within your collaborations, and have you explored things to do about that issue?
Well, one approach that we're using in King County is that when we're redeveloping public housing, we build a certain number of public housing units to state licensing standards for family child care. And we find this as a win-win. We're putting public housing residents into those units who are willing to start a child care business. So they are earning some money, and they are providing culturally competent child care, which is very proximate to their neighbors. We've not significantly scaled up the program because I think one of the challenges is getting our parents who are running these programs up to ever-rising state quality standards, which are legitimate but nonetheless challenging. And there's a need for a greater level of wraparound services on the QA side to make that a success.
A couple of ideas were, currently one of the things that kind of jumps out, being in Minneapolis now, both with the one of the community trade and career schools plus with the schools themselves, is a number of kids who are going to school who are homeless, which we mentioned before. So I think one of the places that we're going to be able to connect is dealing with that. And because the bulk of the family population that we assist is on a voucher, and we're a moving to work agency, so we get to do this, but I think this is the kind of flexibility that we all need, is that I would fool around with some of the subsidy in some way and see if there's not a way to either create some opportunities in how the housing subsidy works that might be non-housing in their impact. And I don't know what that balance looks like, and I don't think there would be enough in that to provide for all the daycare, but I think between a combination of sort of hard assets by providing a spot and, again, shaping the subsidy to look differently to address that particular situation, you might be able to come up with some chemistry with your partner that would work.
So within this 2Gen collaborative, we've come up against a lot of questions and concerns around childcare, about the cost of childcare, the lack of childcare, and the hours that our families need childcare. That there's just really no childcare to speak of. So we've had to begin really thinking outside of the box. Myself working in collaboration with our early childhood division. And we recognize that our state program is very rigid because it has to adhere to the federal requirements of the program. So there's not a lot of flex there. Even with the new changes that have come out of the kind of the reauthorizing or new allowances for childcare, we're still working through our legislature to actually implement those new changes. But so that has also, again, forced us to kind of think outside of the box. So we've started to think about our conversations with employers and how they themselves are a big benefit of having stable childcare as well for employees. Oftentimes, they have ways of structuring their salary and benefits in a way that either they're creating childcare settings within their facilities, or they're willing to invest in childcare providers directly in a location for second shift and third shift childcare, things like that. We've recently had those kind of conversations with Walmart in Minnesota, and they have thought about, okay, so how can we invest in local childcare providers so that we have a bulk of our employees working this shift that are going through. That provides incentive for childcare providers to want to expand their hours, to expand their staffing, as well as the capacity to do so. On our tribal reservations, we also have these issues as well. And it's the lack of child care providers as well as transportation to and from. So we started thinking about that as how can we expand career pathways in that area? How can we build in incentives for current participants of TANF and SNAP to receive training to become child care providers, become licensed, and then also to start building some income revenue building streams for themselves and ultimately for their communities as well. So we've had to start thinking broader, and that's what I would encourage you to do, to start addressing these concerns because it's going to take some imagination and some creativity in order to solve some of these issues.
Are we allowed to have 4 more minutes? They're saying no. Oh, but look at the mic, the guy with the mic. He already.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Okay. Quick question. Eileen Fitzgerald, Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. I actually had 2 questions. The first was the cliff forecaster. If that is it so Minnesota specific, or can it be adopted nationally? And are you working with any policy partners to kind of look at, okay, how do we change the cliffs? And the second was in the last panel, there was a conversation briefly about not accessing any health data for kids. And Steve, you also kind of touched on that briefly, and it just seems that that's such an important element. And I was just wondering kind of how you see that landscape. Thanks.
Okay, you each only get like 30 seconds to answer all of that.
Well, I'll just say, yes, we are working with NGA and CLASP as a part of this network and the TA that they're providing to look at any of the systems-wide policy-specific tools such as the forecaster. And we're open to having discussion about that. So if you're interested in looking at it and having discussions, get a hold of me and we could do that.
Just very quickly, we've built public health, women and infant clinics on 2 of our major sites, and currently we in the Seattle Housing Authority are engaged in a crosswalk with the county public health department to start to unpack the health data, particularly for children, and I completely agree this is a major moving piece in the puzzle.
We have health and wellness for seniors. We have an entire center that the Housing Authority has, and I'd like to see that cross over into the same kind of approach for families as a target. But in that setting, there's all kinds of work that I think is done that would also be readily transferable to families in terms of helping them stay well on the health side. And I'd be interested also in finding more about the CLPHA forecaster at some point.
Thank you very much to everyone. I know we're out of time. Please come up and swap business cards with us if you'd like to continue this conversation. Also, we're about to switch into breakouts. I understand we've got a break for about the next 10 minutes, which someone else will tell you about it.
Yes, it is definitely time for a break. I think we're going to give it a full 15. Come back at 11:35. We're going to prep you for the breakouts. This wall is going to come down then, and we'll have 3 breakout rooms here. But come back at 11:35, and we'll do that. Thanks.